Hey guys, Metal Jesus here, and I am back again with another collection video. This time I'm covering the Sega Genesis. Now you might be surprised that I haven't covered this before on my channel, but the truth is I kind of stopped collecting for this system a while ago because I ended up getting most of the games I was kind of looking for. And so in this video I'm going to give you the highlights from my Sega Genesis collection, of which I have many really cool and interesting games in here. I've got some common games, I've also got some collectible games in here, imports, prototypes, a bunch of really crazy stuff. So, let's take a look. Now I'm going to let you know I'm going to go pretty fast through these because I do have a little over 170 games in the collection, and I don't want to focus on some of the more, obvious ones, some of the more common ones, the ones that people think about when they think of the Sega Genesis and the Mega Drive. So yes, I do have many of the Sonic games and even the Shaq Fu's, but I'm not going to spend a ton of time on those. Instead, I'm going to initially focus on some of the more collectible games in my collection. Now, the interesting thing about the Sega Genesis is that when I first started collecting it, it was mostly loose carts that I would find. However, I do have a decent amount of complete in-box ones, and some of those over the years have become kind of collectible and somewhat rare or maybe expensive to find. The cool thing about the Sega Genesis is that most of these games came out with that plastic clamshell that really protected not only the cartridges, but the manuals and the cover art. And so it can be pretty easy to find, although not all of them came that way, and you're going to see that in a bit here. But like I said, I have a lot of loose cartridges for the system. I would say it's almost 2/3 of the collection is loose cartridges. And to be quite honest, I don't mind. They're easier to store that way. I like playing my games anyways, and so having a loose cart, it's not necessarily a bad thing, and often they are way cheaper than trying to get it complete in box. And so, yeah, here are some of my favorites just right off the bat here. Also some of them that can be a little bit pricey to find, but nothing too crazy. Now, I do have 2 copies of Castlevania Bloodlines, and as you'll see here, there are 2 different types of boxes here, and I'm not sure which one is more common. I don't know. I've kind of collected these over the years. I do like this game a lot, and so on the left you see the plastic clamshell, and then on the right is the cardboard version of it, which I suspect is probably harder to find, only because it would be easier to have these destroyed or maybe tampered with, or you get water on it or something like that. But yeah, such a cool game, and I had to have both versions here. This was during a time when you saw a lot of arcade style games specifically ported over to the home console, and Miss Pac-Man is a pretty interesting version of it here. So you can see it's not a one-to-one recreation of the arcade version. Instead, it's got that kind of almost just, it has a different graphical style to it, which actually I think looks pretty cool. I think the only caveat is that, some of the levels are bigger than the viewer, the viewing screen. So that's kind of odd, not my favorite. And then another game I really like is Super Thunder Blade, especially just for the graphics and its technology that it does with the scaling sprites. That was something that really stood out at the time. These 2 games are pretty cool. Why? Because they are first-person shooting games. Now, Zero Tolerance is more like Wolfenstein or Doom, and Death Duel is more like a, on-rails shooter, but they're both first-person, which is something that you didn't see that much back then on consoles. One of the wild things about the Sega Genesis is just how many variations you get in the packaging. And so this is something I wanted to show here. This is Universal Soldier. Probably not necessarily the best game on the Genesis. However, it's really interesting because it kind of opens up like an old school Amiga game. I have many original Amiga games in my collection, and they all look like this. And so it's very interesting, the tie between the Genesis and the Amiga, and it extends sometimes even to the packaging. Over the years, we've been getting a lot of brand new homebrew games on the Sega Genesis, and this is one of them here. This is Little Medusa, and it's a puzzle game that is really fun, actually. But you see, I have 2 copies here, and the reason for that is because kind of like when you collect vinyl records, sometimes these are put out with multiple color variants for the cartridge. And so for this particular one here, I have the regular one, and I also have the white cartridge version of it. I thought that was very cool. Check this out. This is Duke Nukem 3D, and this was re-released by Pico Interactive. I believe this was back in 2015 or something like that. Now, this is a fully licensed game, by the way. Pico Interactive reached out to them and got the license for it because this was originally only released in Brazil. And so they got the license for it and did this really cool release. I don't know if they sell this anymore, but it's a cool part of my collection. Man, playing these video games is making me hungry.
Too bad I suck at cooking.
Well, thankfully I don't have to worry because Factor is here to help. Are you tired of burning dinner and your sanity? Factor's got your back with fresh, never frozen, chef-crafted meals that are ready faster than you can say, "Now where did I put the manual for my air fryer?" In just 2 minutes, you'll be face first in a delicious, dietitian-approved meal. There's no chopping, cooking, or in my case, crying involved. I mean, even I can do this. Choose from a weekly menu of 35 options, including Calorie Smart, Keto, Protein Plus, or Vegan and Veggie. Oh, and did I mention that they have over 60 add-ons, including breakfast, snacks, and drinks to keep you fueled all day long? I mean, it's basically like having a personal chef, you know, minus the awkward small talk.
You can tell the sweet potato is fresh in here, and it's actually got a little bit of a kick. I like it.
And I'm sure you're like me, you've noticed that some of these delivery apps are getting pretty expensive. Well, you know, Factor's cheaper than takeout, and it's 1,000 times tastier. Plus, you don't have to deal with all those cold fries. So head over to factor75.com or click the link below and use the code 50MetalJesus to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. That's code 50MetalJesus at factor75.com to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. You guys are going to love it. It's super tasty, and I want to thank them for sponsoring this video. For the last couple years, Megacat Studios has been sending me pre-production kind of demos or prototypes of games that they have been kickstarting, and that's what these are right here. That's why they're in black and white, and yeah, this has been really cool to get these, something you don't see very often, but yeah, I like these a lot. These are cool, and the games are great. Especially ZPF. This is a shooter, and so it's near and dear to my heart, so that was really cool to get. Now moving on to something you may not have seen before, that is Call of Duty Ghosts on the Sega Genesis. So this is pretty wild. This is a Russian Mega Drive hack of an unreleased port of the Super Nintendo game Time Trax. And I've had this in my collection for a long time now. It was sent to me by a viewer of the channel many, many years ago, and I thought it was just so cool. And the game is actually pretty fun. And like I said, it's an unreleased version of Time Trax, but they've rebranded it Call of Duty Ghosts. How cool is that? And speaking of shooters, this is Xenocrisis on the Sega Genesis and the Mega Drive. And you'll notice that I have 2 versions right here. Well, that's because they released the English version and they released a Japanese version. But what I love about this is that they didn't stop there. So it's not just the cover. If you look on the back, it's all in Japanese as well. And check this out, like the manuals are both in English and Japanese, depending on the version you get, as well as the cartridge and the mold that they use. So Bitmap Bureau goes all out when they do these special versions for each platform, and that makes them super cool. And it helps that this game is awesome as well, right? In addition to homebrew games, over the years I've also been adding some import games to my collection, and specifically you see 2 of them here, Bare Knuckle and also the original Mortal Kombat. And these are kind of fun to find whenever I'm at expos and things like that. Sometimes they have alternate covers, like you see with Bare Knuckle there, or it's just kind of a cheaper version of a game that you would have got in North America or, in your market. And speaking of imports, here's one I found a couple years ago at an expo, and this is called Space Turtle Ship. And this is a vertical scrolling shooter that was only released in Korea. I love finding these kind of games, and so this is really cool having this in my collection. Over the years, Retrobit has been licensing and putting out collector's editions of some of these games that we did not get in North America. And this is a shooter that was originally only released in Japan, but then they officially licensed it and they put together this really cool special edition. And as you see here, it's got all this cool stuff, including a color cartridge. I just think that looks so cool. And the amazing thing is that back when they were selling this, they would only sell them for like $55. So very affordable. They also did the same thing for Gaiaris, and again, like the other one there, they packed it full all sorts of really cool stuff. And because I'm a shooter fan, of course, I had to jump on this, and another cool colored cartridge. But what I love about these as well is that, you can choose. So you have a reversible cover. So if you want the Japanese one, which I think is way better, well, you can also flip over and use the US one if that's the one you grew up with or you prefer it. So again, love letters to these shooters. But they didn't stop there. They also did this box set that includes Truxton, Hellfire, Fire Shark, and Zero Wing. And so they sold this as well on their website, and each one of these is just, the ultimate version of these. If you like shooters, and that's the thing, the Genesis was home to so many great shooters. And as you see here, of course, they had to do the colored cartridges. I love how they're kind of see-through. They just look so cool, right? And that's the thing, is that the Sega Genesis was the shoot 'em up machine. I don't know what it was about this console, but it seemed like there were just so many really awesome shooters, arcade style shooters released for this console. As a matter of fact, one of the earliest videos I ever did, and it's probably it's probably like my 5th video or something like that, way back in the day in the old game room, was just to cover how many shooters there were. And I didn't even have them all the time. I mean, I don't even know how many there are. It's probably like 30, 40, maybe more. It's crazy, but it's also really fun to collect. Again, especially if you're into that genre. The Genesis is where it's at, man. They gave a similar treatment to the Valis series. So they basically had 1, 2, and 3 in here, but they also had the color cartridges, and then they had this acrylic standee thing. So I thought that was pretty cool. So yeah, Retrobit went all out on the Sega Genesis over the last probably 5 years or so. They've been cranking these out. This isn't even all of them. These are just the ones that I was kind of interested in. But it was also home to some really cool arcade racing games. And you see, obviously, Road Rash 1, 2, and 3 here. Of course I'm going to have those. Although I look at this, I'm like, I need to get the boxed, complete version of Road Rash 1. It's probably not expensive, but yeah, these were really awesome on the system. Plus there was a bunch more, and I have a soft spot for this era of, racing games, these arcade style games on here, just because they're so much fun. They're very pick up and play. Some of them add in a little bit of combat, maybe a little bit of story. Technocop is really cool because it has racing, but then you actually get out of your car and you do some 2D platforming and shooting. That's killer. There's definitely a lot of nostalgia for these type of old school arcade racing games because you're starting to see a lot of homebrew and indie titles released on modern systems that are inspired by these games right here. I have a handful of RPGs for the system, and I like them quite a bit. The thing is that many of them actually are really still fun to play even today. However, the one I really sought after is Shadowrun. Shadowrun, as most of you know, is a cyberpunk RPG based on a board game, but it takes place in Seattle, which of course is very near and dear to my heart. However, the reason why I wanted to get the Genesis version is because, well, there was 2 Shadowruns released, one of them for the Super Nintendo and one of them for the Sega Genesis, and both of them are completely different from each other. So being a fan of that franchise and also old school RPGs, I was very excited to hunt down a copy of it. I don't think it's very expensive, but it is one in the collection where I'm like, yeah, I love that game. I definitely have to mention Herzog Zwei. I think that's how you pronounce that. I originally heard about this game, I think from Pete Dorr or Classic Game Room. Maybe it's both of them, because many people consider this to be one of the best Sega Genesis games ever made. This is a real-time strategy game that predates a lot of the popular titles that you kind of think of when you think of this genre. And, this predates Warcraft, the original Warcraft, Dune 2, Command and Conquer. So it's considered to be very influential to all of those games that came after it. And it's cool that it came out on the Sega Genesis. One of the fun things about collecting the Sega Genesis is that there's many games that didn't come out on the other console, right? The Super Nintendo. And so there's an argument to be made that you need to have both of them. So I've got a bunch of games here that I think are pretty cool on the system, or at least kind of different. Bubble and Squeak. This is a platform puzzle game that was originally released on the Amiga home computer, but then they did a port over to the Amiga CD32. So this is a pretty wild version of the game here, again, on the Genesis. And then here are three kind of weird games that you might not be familiar with, especially if you didn't have a Sega Genesis. Now, again, I'm not going to say these are the best games. They're just kind of different and weird, right? The first one being Mac and Mike Global Gladiators. And when you pop this game in, you're like, wait, why is there a McDonald's logo in this game? Well, that's because it is a sequel, or a spiritual sequel, to an NES game called MC Kids. And yeah, it's a McDonald's restaurant themed platforming game that also has like a environmental kind of message in it. Cosmic Spacehead is a remake of a previous NES game, and this mixes in kind of point-and-click adventure games. That's something that you would play on your PC, but it also has some platforming. Again, kind of a bit of a surprise there. And then the other one I want to mention is Gadget Twins. So this is a really weird shoot-'em-up game where you control the direction of your firing by rotating the aim, and it goes clockwise. One of the buttons basically rotates it that way. This is a very bizarre game. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but I like how they tried to do something different here. And there were just a ton of platform games on this system. I mean, not only this system, but really this generation, right? You couldn't really do 3D graphics very well. And so this was kind of the pinnacle of those 16-bit 2D platforming games, and you got a ton of them that are pretty fun here. Personally, I really like some of the weirder ones. The James Pond series I thought was really fun. Believe it or not, the Cool Spot game is actually pretty fun. It's funny how they used a 7-Up mascot. Of course, this was the era of mascots, and so Cool Spot is pretty cool. No pun intended. I want to mention Flashback because this is one of the physical versions of the game that I have, and it's one that has always haunted me. It's so impressive. The visuals in this game are so impressive, yet I'm so utterly terrible at it. It mocks me. Here are some more platforming games. Again, I just have the loose copies in my collection here, but some fantastic ones, including Rocket Knight Adventures. You've got a bunch of the Mickey games, the Mickey Mouse games, frankly, a bunch of Disney games in general during this time, and many of them actually were really good. It's been interesting to see over the years some of these getting re-released, remastered, and put out on modern systems, So it's cool that these games kind of live on because they were well made. Although, to be clear, I probably shouldn't have included Trampoline Terror in that photo because that's actually not a platforming game. That is a top-down puzzle game, and it's pretty cool, actually, because basically you're trying to defuse these bombs. These aliens have taken over, and you do it by walking over them. This game, it starts off pretty easy, but it gets tricky and difficult very quick. Also, it's exclusive to the Genesis. When I first heard that there is a Motley Crue themed pinball game released on the Genesis, I had to own it. And Crue Ball is a pretty decent one. It's cool. Again, I grew up with Motley Crue. I like those early Motley Crue albums, so this I had to have in my collection. Skitchin is a funny one because I think of this as an iconic Sega Genesis game because you see copies of this everywhere. I don't know what it is about this game. They must have sold millions and millions of copies of it, or people just don't want it or something. I don't know, but it's actually a pretty cool game. Basically, you play as an inline skater and you're trying to grab onto vehicles, hence the Skitchin name. I'm not cool enough to know if that's actually what it was called at the time, but that's what you do in this. The cool thing about this game is that it uses the Road Rash engine. So if it looks familiar, that's why. Back then, every console had to have a Game Genie, and I do have one for the Sega Genesis, although I don't think I've ever actually used it. But I'm sure many of you who grew up with these probably did. This was definitely the era of licensed movie games, and you see a bunch of them here. Lion King, Toy Story, Aladdin, Jurassic Park, plus you've got Terminator, RoboCop. I mean, that's just off the top of my head. It's like there are tons of them at this time. I remember when I first started getting into the Sega Genesis and I was looking around trying to get suggestions of games to pick up day one, and Dynamite Headdy came up time and time again, and I can definitely see why. This is a 2D platforming game like so many others on the system, but it just has enough personality and also gameplay elements to really make it stand out. It's such a cool game. At the time, there were so many of these Tetris-like clones, and every system had to have them. There was lots of them out there, and I have to say that Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine is one of my favorites. It's a cool one. It's going to be no surprise to you guys, I don't have a ton of sports games, to be quite honest. Most of them that are in my collection are pretty much there by accident. Usually, either finding some in a collection online, or maybe somebody sent me one, and so I don't really collect a lot of sports titles. I don't play a lot of sports titles. However, the Genesis is definitely known for having a bunch of sports titles. I will say, one of the caveats to that is Speedball 2 Brutal Deluxe. Now, I originally played this on my Commodore 64, I believe, but this is, calling this a sports title, it's a futuristic sports title, but I'm going to count it because it's awesome on the Genesis, and this is a cool version. And again, that's the thing about the Sega Genesis, is that it is a joy to collect for because it's just different enough from every other console out there to really feel special. The final thing I want to mention is that, collecting physical original games is obviously really fun, but it's also a challenge and it can be kind of pricey. And so I do want to mention at the end here is that if you just want to play the games on original hardware, I think emulation is the way to go. You see that I've got a couple products here that I've used over the years all the time. And not only that, but it's actually really handy to do that if you want to check out a game and see if you like it or not before you ever put down the cash. So just want to mention that here at the end. And so I'm pretty happy with my collection at this point, and I didn't really get into the other stuff around it because you also have the 32X games and you have the Sega CD games, and that would probably be another video at some point. I don't have nearly as many of those, but I do have some pretty interesting ones and some very collectible ones. So if you're interested in seeing that in the future, I'd be happy to do it. But let me know what you think of my collection down in the comments below. Is there a particular game you are shocked to not see included in this list? I need to know about it. Let me know down in the comments, because maybe I can find a decent copy somewhere. And as always, guys, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for subscribing, and take care.